August 1980. The air over Gdańsk is thick, not just with the salt of the Baltic and the metallic tang of the shipyards, but with something new, something sharp: fear. In Warsaw, at the grey, imposing headquarters of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, telex machines chatter with a manic intensity. The reports clatter in, line by line, from their counterparts on the coast. They are reports of failure, reports of impossibility. For the men in these offices, the officers of the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, the Polish secret police, the SB control is everything. It is the air they breathe. They control the paper mills. They control the printing presses, right down to the mimeograph machines in local schools. They control the radio antennae, the television broadcasts, the telephone switchboards. They control the food distribution networks. They control the unions. An unauthorized meeting of 10 people is a security breach. A strike of 50 is an insurrection. What is happening at the Lenin shipyard is therefore impossible. It began on August 14th. A protest. The firing of a crane operator, Anna Walentinowicz. A familiar story. Such localized work stoppages, as the party media called them, were routine. They were headaches, not crises. You isolate the ringleaders. You cut off their communication. You send in the ZOMO, the motorized riot police, and the fear of the truncheon does the rest. By nightfall, the workers are back at their lathes. But this time, the script was wrong. The strike didn't fizzle. It didn't break. When the shipyard management, backed by party officials, tried to negotiate with the initial strike committee, a young, mustachioed electrician named Lech Wałęsa didn't just stand on a bulldozer and talk about pay, he talked about rights. He talked about a new, independent union. And the strike spread. This was the first impossibility. Within days, it wasn't just the Lenin shipyard, it was the entire Gdańsk-Sopot-Gdynia area. Dozens of factories, transport hubs, and other enterprises joined in. They formed an inter-factory strike committee, the MKS. The telexes arriving in Warsaw became frantic. The SB agents on the ground were reporting a logistical phantom. The strikers are organized. One report read, the ink seeming to bleed with panic. They have food. They are distributing supplies. They are printing bulletins. This was the detail that chilled the blood of the men in Warsaw and their silent, watchful partners from the KGB station. Printing. To print, you need paper. Not just a few sheets stolen from an office, but reams, industrial quantities. You need ink. You need stencils, or mimeograph machines, or God forbid an actual printing press. In the Polish People's Republic, these items were more controlled than firearms. The state was the press. Yet, a new newspaper was appearing. Solidarność. Solidarity. It was crude, ink-smudged, but it was everywhere. It listed the MKS's demands. It reported on negotiations. It bypassed the state media blockade as if it didn't exist. SB agents, indistinguishable from the shipyard workers, moved through the crowds. Their informants, cultivated over decades, were activated. Where does the paper come from? They were asked. The informants had no answers. It just appears. Who brings the food? We don't know. Lorries arrive. They are waved through the strike guards. Who is coordinating with the factory in Elbląg? They use runners. But the messages are too fast, too complex. The SB set up listening posts. Vans bristling with antennae parked on the streets outside the shipyard, their magnetic reels spinning silently, capturing the ether. They heard static. They heard the state-run radio. They heard nothing. The MKS was communicating, coordinating a mass movement that had paralyzed the entire Baltic coast, and the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the Eastern Bloc was deaf. This phantom organization was the true enemy. It was a ghost in their own machine. It operated in defiance of all logic. A workers' protest, by their Marxist-Leninist definition, should be chaotic. It should be desperate, fueled by anger and bread shortages. This was not desperate. It was disciplined. It was funded. The reports that landed on desks in Moscow, at the Lubyanka and inside the Kremlin were even more stark. The KGB's assessment was brutal. The Polish SB was incompetent. The Polish United Workers' Party, the PZPR, was weak. But beyond that, they saw a new, terrifying signature. Yuri Andropov, the calculating, ascetic head of the KGB, saw it clearly. This was not a spontaneous Polish uprising. The 1970s had seen protests, but they were riots, quickly smashed. This was an operation. An enemy intelligence service was at work. It had to be. The CIA, West Germany's BND, MI6. It was the only explanation that fit their worldview. The problem was, they couldn't find the fingerprints. The KGB activated its own networks inside Poland, its illegals, and its assets within the Catholic Church, within the academic world. They hunted for the CIA case officer, the dead drop, the coded radio transmission. They searched for the secret bank account, the bagman, the courier. They found priests giving sermons about human dignity. They found intellectuals writing essays. They found workers sharing bread. They found a movement, but they could not find its engine. It was a body without a heart, a puppet without strings. It was impossible. This is the kind of historical mystery we unravel on this channel. We look at the events that baffled the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. If you want to understand the hidden mechanics of the Cold War and how a shipyard electrician checkmated a superpower, subscribe to Cold War Impact. We're just getting started. For the Soviets, the stakes were not just about Poland. Poland was the linchpin. It was the largest and most powerful of the Warsaw Pact satellite states. It was the geographical barrier between the Soviet Union and NATO's front line in West Germany. If Poland wobbled, if it broke free from the party's absolute control, the entire Soviet security architecture in Eastern Europe could collapse. The mystery of the Solidarity Organization was therefore an existential threat. This was not about tractors or wheat yields. This was about the survival of the Soviet Empire. And the phantom was growing stronger. The SB and their KGB masters watched in horror as the MKS leadership, fronted by Wałęsa, met with the government's negotiators. The strikers were not cowed. They were not intimidated by the implicit threat of the Soviet tanks garrisoned on Polish soil. They had a list of 21 demands. And the first demands were not for bread. They were for an independent trade union, a direct challenge to the party's monopoly on power. They demanded freedom of speech, the release of political prisoners. These were not the demands of a hungry mob. These were the demands of a counter-revolution. Where did this political sophistication come from? Who was advising them? The SB had detailed files on every known dissident in the country. The KOR, the Workers' Defense Committee, was a group of intellectuals they had watched for years. But the KOR were a handful of writers and academics, constantly under surveillance, their apartments bugged, their typewriters registered. They could not possibly be the logistical source for a movement that now numbered in the millions. It was a ghost. A political, logistical, and financial ghost. The investigation was a failure. The bugs heard nothing. The informants saw nothing. The patrols found nothing. On August 31st, 1980, the impossible happened. The Polish government caved. Deputy Prime Minister Mieczysław Jagielski sat at a table with Lech Wałęsa in the shipyard. In front of the world's cameras, he signed the Gdańsk Agreement. The government agreed to the 21 demands. It recognized the right to an independent trade union. The phantom had won. The state, with its total control of the military, the police, and the economy, had been brought to its knees by an entity that, according to all their intelligence, should not exist. For the men in Warsaw and Moscow, the celebration in the streets of Gdańsk was not an end. It was the beginning of a terrifying new war. The ghost now had a legal name, Solidarność, but its source, its power, and its funding remained a complete and terrifying mystery. The hunt for that source would become the most desperate intelligence operation of the 1980s. They had to find the puppet master. They had to find the wound. Because if they didn't, Poland was already lost. For the Kremlin, the Gdańsk Agreement was not a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire, signed under duress. It was a humiliating, temporary concession to an enemy they could not identify. The winter of 1980 descended on Warsaw with a grim, biting cold, and with it, a new, far more dangerous phase of the war began. The ghost now had a name, Solidarność, but this only made the mystery more maddening. The organization, now legal, exploded. It was no longer a committee in a shipyard. It was a national movement. Within a year, nearly 10 million people, a quarter of Poland's entire population, had joined. It was the only independent trade union in the entire Soviet bloc. The KGB and the Polish SB faced a horrifying new problem. They were no longer hunting a small clandestine cell of dissidents. They were hunting the logistical and financial spine of a parallel government. The scramble to find the source was an operation of unprecedented scale. The KGB residentura in Warsaw was tripled. Moscow dispatched specialists from the first Chief Directorate's Line R, Operational Analysis, and Line K, Counterintelligence. Their Polish counterparts, under the cold, professional gaze of Interior Minister Czesław Kiszczak, launched a dozen overlapping operations. The goal was singular: find the puppet master, find the money, find the equipment. The last item was the one that kept the analysts at the Lubyanka awake at night. Equipment. A 10 million member organization needs more than just charismatic leaders. It needs an industrial-scale infrastructure. It needs offices. It needs telephones. It needs transportation. And more than anything else, it needs a voice. In the Polish People's Republic, the state owned every major printing press. It rationed every ton of paper. It licensed every typewriter. Yet, solidarity was drowning the country in ink. Underground newspapers, known as bibuła, blotting paper, were no longer a few dozen sheets passed hand to hand. They were full-fledged publications. Tygodnik Solidarność, Solidarity Weekly, achieved a print run of 500,000 copies per issue. Books, banned by the state censors, were being published and distributed by the thousand. Posters, leaflets and bulletins appeared on factory walls and church doors, as if by magic. General Kiszczak's SB units tore the country apart, looking for the source. They bugged every known Solidarity office. They placed informants in every major factory committee. They launched Operation Zenit to install advanced listening devices in Lech Wałęsa's home in Gdańsk and in the confessional booths of Street Brigida's church, where he often met with his advisors. The reels turned. The agents listened, and they heard nothing. They heard priests offering spiritual guidance. They heard union members arguing over bylaws. They heard Wałęsa complaining about his workload. They never heard the crucial conversation. They never heard the call, "The shipment of paper will arrive at midnight." They never heard the address of the secret printing facility. They never heard the name of the CIA bagman. The entire apparatus of the movement was a black hole. It consumed resources from an unknown source and produced a revolutionary output. SB commando units, the ZOMO, acting on a rare tip from an informant, would raid a suspected print shop in a Warsaw basement. They would smash down the door, weapons ready, only to find an empty room. The air would be thick with the acrid smell of fresh ink and chemicals, the concrete floor still bearing the vibration marks of a heavy machine. But the press itself, a machine weighing several tons, would be gone, vanished. Smuggled out and relocated in the dead of night, past the police patrols and the military checkpoints, without a single witness. The paranoia within the security services became a living thing. The enemy was a bogeyman, a shapeshifter. First, they developed the Vatican theory. This was the most obvious. The election of a Polish Pope, Karol Wojtyła, as John Paul II in 1978 was clearly the spiritual catalyst. His visit in 1979 had electrified the nation. Logic dictated that the Vatican Bank, with its vast, untraceable wealth, was funneling millions in hard currency to the church, which then distributed it to Solidarity. The SB's Department 4, dedicated to monitoring the church, went into overdrive. They tracked every priest, every bishop. They tried to trace the flow of every donation. They found, to their frustration, that while the church provided immense moral and spiritual support, it was not a logistical giant. It couldn't smuggle multi-ton printing presses. The priests were preaching revolution, but they weren't the ones driving the supply trucks. This led to the second, more comfortable theory: classic CIA subversion. This was the enemy they knew. They hunted for the traditional tradecraft. They tailed every cultural attaché and third secretary from the American embassy on Aleje Ujazdowski. They monitored dead drop sites in Łazienki Park. They searched for coded signals on shortwave radio. Again, they found nothing. The CIA station in Warsaw was, by all accounts, operating on a standard diplomatic footing. They were meeting contacts, writing reports, but they were not, as far as the SB could prove, directing a 10 million-strong national uprising. There was no Colonel Ryan handing suitcases of cash to Lech Wałęsa in a dark alley. The failure to find a conventional enemy forced their conclusions into the realm of the fantastic. The bogeyman grew. Perhaps the CIA was using the Vatican as its cutout? Perhaps West German intelligence, the BND, was using humanitarian aid convoys to smuggle in the equipment? The conspiracy had to become massive and convoluted. because the simple, terrifying truth that this movement was somehow self-sustaining or was being supplied by a method they could not even detect was an admission of total impotence. This phantom infrastructure was not just an annoyance, it was an existential threat. It meant the party had lost its most fundamental weapon, the monopoly on information. The government would broadcast its decrees on state television, and the next morning, a solidarity leaflet would appear on every factory floor, deconstructing the lies and giving the real story. The state was being fact-checked in real time by a ghost. By late 1981, the situation was untenable. The Polish economy was in freefall. Solidarity, feeling its power, was pushing for free elections. The Kremlin, led by the ailing Brezhnev but with the hardline Andropov whispering in his ear, had lost all patience. Soviet divisions were massing on Poland's eastern border. The threat of a fraternal invasion, just like Czechoslovakia in '68, was palpable. General Wojciech Jaruzelski, the ramrod-straight tinted glasses wearing leader of Poland, was trapped. He was a Polish nationalist, but also a Moscow-trained communist. He had to choose between a Soviet invasion that would drown his country in blood, or something else. He chose to do the job himself. He chose to kill the Phantom with the one weapon they had left, overwhelming brute force. The investigation was over. The hunt had failed. Now, the crackdown would begin. On the freezing night of December 13th, 1981, Operation Jodwa, Fur, and Operation Azalea, were launched. A Military Council of National Salvation declared Stan Wojciech martial law. This was the state's ultimate admission of failure. If you cannot find the source of the infection, you quarantine the entire country. All telephone lines in the nation were cut simultaneously, plunging the country into an eerie silence. Tanks rolled through the snow-filled streets of Warsaw and Gdańsk. ZOMO units, acting with terrifying precision, used the lists the SB had been compiling for a year. They smashed down the doors of apartments, hotels, and union offices. In one night, they arrested the entire Solidarity leadership. Lech Wałęsa was taken from his flat. Thousands of activists, intellectuals, and organizers were rounded up and sent to internment camps. The union was declared illegal. Its offices were seized, its assets frozen. The bogeyman, it seemed, had finally been captured. The Phantom had been chained. In the Kremlin, there was a grim sigh of relief. The crisis was contained. The brute force of the state had, as always, prevailed. But then, weeks later, in the dead of winter, the impossibility returned. A new leaflet appeared, tacked to a wall in a Warsaw suburb. The ink was smeared, the paper of poor quality, but the message was clear. It was signed by the fugitive underground leadership, Solidarność żyje, Solidarity lives. They had cut off the head, but the body still moved. They had seized the offices, but the printing presses, the ones they could never find, were still running. The ghost was still in the machine. The hunt had been a catastrophic failure, and the mystery was deeper and more terrifying than they had ever imagined. While General Jaruzelski's tanks idled in the frozen streets of Warsaw and the Polish SB congratulated themselves on decapitating the Solidarity movement, the real war was just beginning. It was not a war that would be fought by the KGB's Line K counterintelligence officers. They had spent a year hunting for a phantom, and they had failed. They failed because they were looking in all the wrong places. They were looking for a traditional spy ring. They were looking for a CIA case officer in a trench coat, a numbered Swiss bank account, a dead drop in a park. They were looking for an enemy they understood. The enemy they faced was something new, and its source was not hidden in a secret bunker. It was operating in plain sight from the most powerful office on Earth. In Washington, D.C., the declaration of martial law was not seen as a Soviet victory. It was seen as an act of profound weakness. A state that must use its own army to occupy its own people has already lost the argument. For the new administration in the White House, this was not a crisis to be managed. It was an opportunity to be exploited. President Ronald Reagan, in a way the KGB analysts could never fully comprehend, genuinely believed the Soviet Union was an evil empire. Not just a geopolitical rival, but a moral and structural failure that was destined for the ash heap of history. He was not interested in détente. He was interested in winning. And his chosen weapon was a man who thought just like him, William Bill Casey, the new director of Central Intelligence, Casey was not a cautious bureaucrat. He was a veteran of the OSS, the legendary World War II intelligence service. He understood that wars were won not just with tanks but with information, with morale, and with money. When Reagan and Casey looked at Poland, they didn't see a lost cause. They saw a beachhead. In early 1982, Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 32. On its face, it was a list of economic sanctions and diplomatic protests. But buried within it was a secret, audacious objective: to provide material, financial, and logistical support to the now-banned Solidarity movement. The goal was no longer just to protest. The goal was to keep the underground resistance alive and fighting until the Polish government was forced to break. This was the birth of the Phantom. But how do you arm a 10 million member organization when it's being occupied by its own army and watched by the KGB? The old CIA methods were useless. Any agent they sent in would be caught. Any bag of cash they delivered would be traced. The Soviets were expecting that. The American solution was a masterstroke of asymmetrical warfare. It was a strategy of plausible deniability, so brilliant that the KGB stared right at it for years and refused to believe what they were seeing. The plan had 3 pillars. First, the spiritual pillar, the Vatican. Casey, a devout Catholic, began taking secret, unannounced trips to Rome. He met not just with Vatican officials, but with Pope John Paul II himself, the Polish Pope, the man whose visit had lit the original fire. The Pope and the President, in what historian Carl Bernstein would later call a holy alliance, agreed on a shared goal: Poland must be free. The Church was the one organization in Poland that the communist state could not crush. It had a presence in every village. It had a distribution network of priests, bishops, and parishes that was 1,000 times more efficient than any spy network. And it had the one thing the CIA lacked: the total unwavering trust of the Polish people. The Church would become the primary distribution channel, the spiritual and moral cover for the entire operation. Second, the political pillar, the AFL-CIO. This was the genius of the operation. Who better to support a trade union than the largest and most powerful trade union federation in the free world? It was the perfect cover. The KGB was hunting for spies, but the operation was being run by American labor organizers. The head of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, became a crucial partner. The CIA, and later the newly formed National Endowment for Democracy, NED, began funneling millions of dollars not to the CIA station in Warsaw, but to the AFL-CIO's international arm, the Free Trade Union Institute. Third, the logistical pillar, the European network. The AFL-CIO didn't just fly a plane full of cash to Gdańsk. That was amateurish. Instead, they activated a complex web of European partners. Money from the US was sent to allied unions in Sweden, France, Italy, and Great Britain. These organizations in turn began a massive smuggling operation. This was the source of the impossible equipment. This was the answer to the mystery of the vanishing printing presses. The KGB and SB were looking for a complete, multi-ton offset press being smuggled across the border. They were fools. The Americans and their allies were smuggling it in pieces. A truck marked humanitarian aid from a French Catholic charity would cross the border. In its manifests, it listed medical supplies or powdered milk. Buried inside in a false compartment would be the ink rollers and gearboxes for an offset press. A separate shipment from a Swedish trade union, hidden in a private car, would carry the motor and the electrical components. A third shipment, perhaps through a diplomatic pouch, would carry the sensitive electronics and stencil makers. These components, useless on their own, would be delivered to separate, pre-arranged church safehouses. Only then would an underground solidarity team collect them, move them to a new, secret basement, and assemble them. The press that the Zomo had missed by minutes in Part 2 wasn't smuggled out. It was designed to be disassembled into 5-man portable pieces and carried out a back window in under 10 minutes. This was American ingenuity at its finest. They weren't just sending money, they were sending a samizdat, self-publishing factory in a box. While the KGB was monitoring shortwave radio for coded messages, the Americans were sending Solidarity, the most advanced, secure communications gear available. This included state-of-the-art, high-speed radio transmitters, secure fax machines, and eventually, personal computers with encryption software. The Solidarity underground, operating from attics and basements, often had better, faster, and more secure communication equipment than the Polish secret police who were hunting them. The money was just as clever. Hard currency American dollars was the lifeblood of the resistance. It paid for safe houses. It supported the families of the thousands of activists who had been jailed, ensuring their loyalty. It paid for bribes. It was smuggled in by couriers, hidden in the baggage of visiting priests, sewn into the lining of coats, or passed via the AFL-CIO's network. This multi-pronged, plausibly deniable pipeline CIA money, filtered through American and European trade unions, delivered by a network of priests and activists carrying high-tech, modular equipment, was the ghost. It was an operation the Soviets were structurally incapable of understanding. Their worldview was rigid. The CIA runs spies, the church runs religion, and unions are tools of the state. The idea that all three could be coordinated in a seamless, decentralized, and ideologically driven operation was alien to them. The American solution was not to meet the Soviets tank for tank. It was to bypass the battlefield entirely. It was to wage a political, informational, and economic war that the Soviet system was unequipped to fight. They were arming the Polish people with the one weapon the party could not defeat: the truth. And they were printing it, 500,000 copies at a time. For 5 long years, he was the ghost. While Lech Wałęsa sat under house arrest, a neutralized icon, the real resistance was led by a man the SB could not find. Zbigniew Buczak, a former electrician from the Ursus tractor factory. He was the chairman of the Warsaw branch of Solidarity, and after the crackdown he had simply vanished. Buczak became the ultimate bogeyman for General Kiszczak's interior ministry. He was a living embodiment of their failure. From an unseen network of attics and basements, he ran the Temporary Coordinating Commission, TKK, the underground government of the banned union. He coordinated the print shops. He directed the flow of information. He was the phantom in the machine. The hunt for Buczak was the largest manhunt in the history of the Polish People's Republic. It consumed millions of man-hours. His face, often in crude disguises, was on posters in every police station. Every known associate was bugged, tailed, and repeatedly detained. They arrested his wife. They leaned on his friends. They sowed disinformation that he had fled to the West, that he had stolen union money. And for 5 years, he eluded them. He was a whisper, a rumor, a signature on a leaflet. Then, on May 31st, 1986, they got him. A tip from a newly recruited informant. A grey apartment block in Warsaw. The SB Commando Unit, the GROM, though not yet formally named, moved with total precision. They didn't knock. They smashed the door. And there he was, the ghost, in the flesh. The celebration at the ministry was immediate. They had done it. They had finally cut the head off the underground. The phantom was in chains. Then, the shock began. This was not the part that had been in the newspapers for 5 years. This was the part that was sealed in the after-action reports, classified top secret, and sent directly to Warsaw and Moscow. The shock was not the man they had captured. It was the room he was in. The agents cataloguing the contents of the safe house were trained to find mimeograph machines and stacks of leaflets. They were expecting a crude, dissident's hovel. Instead, they found a high-tech command center. On a table sat a Commodore 64 computer. In the corner, another, an Atari. These were not children's toys. They were loaded with custom-made encryption software. They found sophisticated, high-speed shortwave radio equipment capable of burst transmissions, sending or receiving an entire message's worth of data in less than a second. A signal too short for the state's listening posts to triangulate. They found specialized directional antennae. And they found the money. Stacks of it. Not just Polish zloty, which was worthless, but crisp, new American dollars, thousands upon thousands of dollars. For the KGB analysts and the SB leadership, this was the confrontation. This was the moment the legend died and the horrifying truth took its place. Zbigniew Buczak, the tractor factory electrician, did not build this. Polish intellectuals did not invent this encryption. This equipment, when they traced its origins, was not available on any market in the Eastern Bloc. It came from West Germany, from Sweden, from France. The software was American. The money was American. This was not a popular uprising. This was a war. The reports that had been filtering in for years, reports of American bluster, of Reagan's speeches, of the National Endowment for Democracy, of the AFL-CIO's humanitarian aid, had been dismissed by the old guard. It was propaganda. It was political theater. The CIA, they knew, operated with spies and traitors. But the evidence, lying on a table in a Warsaw apartment, was undeniable. The Americans were not running a spy ring. They were funding and equipping a parallel state. The realization that dawned on Moscow and Warsaw was this: they had been fighting the wrong enemy. They had been hunting for a puppet master, a single CIA spy master. But the enemy was an idea, weaponized by the full industrial and financial might of the West. The enemy was a decentralized network. The AFL-CIO, which they viewed as a toothless tool of capitalism, was acting as a logistical quartermaster, smuggling equipment through a complex web of European trade unions. The Catholic Church, which they tried to control and intimidate, was the distribution network, its priests and parishes serving as the couriers and safe houses. The money, the tens of millions of dollars, was not being delivered in suitcases by spies. It was being wired, openly, from the US Congress to the NED, which then passed it to the AFL-CIO, which then passed it to a dozen different European groups, who then smuggled it, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, into Poland. It was a ghost, funded by illegal, public-facing bureaucracy. It was the most brilliant, most terrifying covert operation the KGB had ever faced, because most of it wasn't even covert. It was just plausible. The shock was total. All their counterintelligence tradecraft, the bugs, the informants, the blackmail was useless. How do you arrest a French trade union? How do you blackmail the Vatican Bank? How do you stop a radio signal that is faster than your equipment? Their response, faced with this unwinnable asymmetrical war, had been one of brute, clumsy, and ultimately futile force. The most horrific example had come 2 years before Bujak's capture. In their desperation, a group of SB agents from the fanatical Department 4, which monitored the church, decided to take matters into their own hands. They believed that if they could terrorize the symbol of the church's resistance, they could break the network. Their target was a priest, Father Jerzy Popiełuszko. He was a charismatic, outspoken Warsaw priest who held masses for the fatherland that had become standing-room-only sermons of resistance. He was a living link between the church, the workers, and the intellectual leadership of solidarity. He was, in the SB's eyes, a key node in the Phantom Network. On the night of October 19th, 1984, 3 SB agents, led by Captain Grzegorz Piotrowski, abducted him. They had trailed him, pulled him over in a fake traffic stop, beaten him, and thrown him in the trunk of their unmarked Fiat. This was not a sanctioned operation, but an act of pure desperation. It was the lashing out of a security service that was failing. They beat him senseless. They bound him, tied bags of rocks to his feet, and threw his living, half-conscious body off a dam into the Vistula River. It was a futile, idiotic, and monstrous act. It was the old Soviet method. When in doubt, use terror. Kill the messenger. But this too failed. It backfired in a way that shook the state to its very foundation. When Father Popiełuszko's body was recovered from the icy water 10 days later, the state's attempt to silence him turned him into a martyr. His funeral, on November 3rd, was not a small, quiet affair. It was quite possibly the largest political demonstration in Poland since the 1970s. An estimated 400,000 people descended on Warsaw. They marched in total defiant silence. Workers stood next to intellectuals. Lech Wałęsa himself, released from house arrest, stood shoulder to shoulder with priests and bishops. The crowd was a sea of solidarity banners, banners that had been printed on the very presses the SB was trying to find. The murder of Father Popiełuszko, the state's ultimate act of intimidation, had become the resistance's greatest propaganda victory. The state had proved, in one single act of brutality, that it was a government of thugs and murderers. It had confirmed everything the underground press had been saying. It had united the people, the church, and the band union in a single, unshakable block of moral outrage. This was the futile countermeasure. They could arrest Bujak, they could kill Popiełuszko, they could jam the airwaves, but they could not stop the money. They could not stop the modular printing presses, which were reassembled as fast as they were seized. They could not stop the 10 million people who now believed in the ghost. The Soviet model of control, a centralized pyramid of fear, was technologically and ideologically obsolete. The Americans had funded a decentralized, information-based network, a political swarm, and the bear, in its rage, had only succeeded in swatting itself. The end came not with a bang, but with a concession. By 1988, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging. The war in Afghanistan was a bleeding wound. The arms race, pushed into overdrive by Reagan's technological offensive, was bankrupting the treasury. And in Poland, the economy was a basket case, crushed by Western sanctions and the regime's own profound incompetence. The phantom, which they had hunted, arrested, and martyred, was stronger than ever. The underground presses, funded by the American pipeline, were still running. The clandestine radio stations were still broadcasting. The people, after 8 years of martial law and repression, were not broken, they were just waiting. General Jaruzelski, the man who had declared martial law to save Poland from Soviet invasion, was now being told by a new, pragmatic leader in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev, that the invasions were over. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. The Polish regime was on its own. Trapped, with no Soviet tanks to back him and a population that despised him, Jaruzelski did the unthinkable. He invited the Phantom to dinner. In February 1989, the Round Table talks began. On one side of the table sat the Communist Party leadership, the men who ran the army and the secret police. On the other side sat Lech Wałęsa, Zbigniew Bujak, and the very men the SB had been hunting as terrorists for nearly a decade. The state was forced to negotiate with the ghost it had failed to exorcise. The party believed it had one last trick. They would manage the decline, they would co-opt solidarity, they offered what they called semi-free elections. They would keep a 65% majority of the seats in the main parliament, the Sejm, reserved for themselves and their puppet parties. But, as a concession, they would allow a completely free election for the remaining 35%, and for a newly created and supposedly powerless Senate. It was the ultimate, fatal miscalculation. They believed their own propaganda. They believed the people were tired, apathetic, and would settle for a compromise. They believed the Solidarity leadership was a small clique of intellectuals, disconnected from the masses. The election was set for June 4, 1989. Solidarity, legalized just 2 months prior, had no time, no state media access, and no official infrastructure. All it had was the network. The network of priests, of activists, of students. And the equipment, the printing presses, the computers, the ink, and the money that had been flowing from Washington via the AFL-CIO for 8 solid years. The Solidarity Citizens Committee put up a single iconic poster, a black and white image of Gary Cooper from the film High Noon. He strides forward, a ballot in his hand instead of a gun. Above him, the Solidarity logo. Below, the simple words, High Noon, the 4th of June, 1989. It was the perfect message. The showdown was here. The results of that election are the killer statistic. They are the final verdict on the Soviet system, the KGB, the secret police, and the entire communist project. It was not a defeat for the party. It was an obliteration. Solidarity won 99 out of the 100 available seats in the new Senate. The one remaining seat was won by an independent who was also anti-communist. In the contested elections for the Sejm, Solidarity candidates won all 161 seats they were allowed to run for. The political kill ratio was, in effect, 260 to 1. But the true humiliation, the number that sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated terror through every communist capital from East Berlin to Bucharest to Moscow, was what happened to the party's reserved list. Even on the ballot for the 65% of seats they had guaranteed themselves, many top party leaders, running unopposed, were so hated that voters crossed out their names in defiance. They failed to achieve the 50% threshold required for victory. The party had not only lost the free election, it had lost its own rigged one. The Phantom, born in the Gdańsk shipyard and kept alive by American ingenuity, had won. The government, and the entire Soviet security apparatus that backed it, had been proven impotent. The game was over. This was the macro theme of the entire Cold War, distilled into one operation. The Soviet Union was a system built for imitation, not innovation. It was a top-down, centralized, industrial-age monolith. It was brilliant at stealing the American plans for the atomic bomb. It was brilliant at reverse engineering a B-29 bomber. It was brilliant at building 10,000 identical tanks and crushing a popular uprising in Budapest or Prague with brute, overwhelming force. But it was hopelessly, systemically incapable of competing with a network. The American solution in Poland was not a traditional covert operation. It was a new kind of war. The KGB was hunting for a thing to smash, a spy to arrest, a bank account to freeze, a transmitter to triangulate. But the Americans funded a process. They funded an ecosystem. The Soviets could register every typewriter in the country. They could not compete with 1,000 modular, high-speed printing presses, smuggled in pieces by a dozen different Allied unions and hidden in 100 different church basements. The KGB could bug every known dissident. They could not compete with encrypted burst transmissions and secure fax machines provided by the CIA's technical services. The Soviet system ran on lies. Its power was derived from its monopoly on information. The American operation was, at its core, about truth. It armed the Polish people with the fact that their government was illegitimate, and it gave them the technology to spread that fact faster than the state could possibly censor it. This was the fatal flaw of the entire Soviet project. It could imitate a microchip. It could not imitate Silicon Valley. It could intimidate a worker. It could not defeat 10 million of them, all reading the same leaflet, all listening to the same clandestine broadcast. The operation to support solidarity was perhaps the single most successful high-return on investment intelligence operation of the entire Cold War. For the cost of a few dozen $1 million a year, a rounding error in the Pentagon's budget, the United States crippled the Polish regime, accelerated the economic collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and ultimately dislodged the first, crucial domino that would lead to the fall of the entire Soviet Empire. The great conflict of the 20th century was not, in the end, decided by the nuclear missiles that sat silent in their silos. It was not decided by the great tank armies that faced each other across the Fulda Gap. It was won in the shipyard of Gdańsk by a mustachioed electrician who refused to be silenced. It was won in the dark basements of Warsaw, by men and women printing illegal newspapers on machines they had assembled by hand from smuggled parts. It was won by a brave priest whose murder at the hands of the secret police exposed the regime's moral bankruptcy to the entire world. The mystery that so terrified the KGB, the phantom organization that was funded by no one, that was led by no one, that existed everywhere at once, was the future. It was the decentralized, information-based and freedom-oriented network that a centralized, fear-based industrial empire could not comprehend. The Berlin Wall did not fall in November 1989 because it was stormed by an army. It was pushed over by 1 million ordinary people who had been watching the events in Poland. They had seen the ghost win. They had seen that the phantom was real. And they realized, in that one final, earth-shattering moment, that the empire, which had seemed so permanent and so powerful, was nothing but a hollow shell.